What deep? Some new fremen prophet.
Repression only makes a religion flourish.
Guess I'm not in the mood today.
They're not human, they're brutal!
Squeeze rather. Squeeze hard.
Yes, Uncle.
I can see the future.
Dune.
Sonic Ape! But there are rules within rules.
This video is brought to you by One Last Fight. Have you ever wanted to have the feeling of an epic showdown with a big bad fantasy monster full of role-playing but didn't have the GM and or time to do it? Well, this is it in 1 to 2 hours. One Last Fight is a GM-less showdown against your group's nemesis as you and your fellow asymmetric adventurers do your final quest to defeat them, or die trying. But it's about the story, like there's role-playing jumping off points everywhere where the game will ask you questions. What's the backstory of your characters and bad guy? What happens when I flip over challenge? What about this weapon? There's zero prep needed, no GM needed, and there's practically no rules overhead because I just went through the rulebook. Just grab your friends and choose from multiple characters, then roleplay and don't shy away from this roguelike. So if you're interested in One Last Fight, check out the link in the description below. Now back to the video. This is an epic 1v1 war game, War for Arrakis. That's right, Dune is coming from the big screen and from the first book to your table. And it's actually kind of streamlined. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of streamlined, even though this game is gigantic. So how could this be? Well, we have to bring up this game's predecessor, the fantasy epic game War of the Ring, which we also reviewed. War of the Ring was the big 1v1 thematic game for fantasy fans with the free people versus the shadow forces fighting across Middle-earth amongst countless hours. Did it have its problems? Yes, but it was so much theme-meaning gameplay and with such good game design, and it was released 20 years ago, so it was hard to fault it too much. Now we have a lot of similar ideas with a lot of the same design team here, like you have action dice to roll every round, but now it's for Dune, and now it's a 2-hour game instead of a 3 to 4 hour plus game. This is quite impressive. And it took me a while, but I finally got around to buying it and playing this multiple times, so now we're reviewing it for you guys. War for Arrakis is a streamlined asymmetric struggle between the Atriedes and Harkonnen across the planet, as legions and characters fight around spice, important sieges and settlements, and of course worry about the desert and sandworms. With such a loaded IP and a lot of 2024 quality of life improvements, is this still a suitable replacement for War of the Ring, or is it more of a supplement? Also, how might it compare against this 1v1 thematic game, Star Wars Rebellion? Before moving on, the number of plays are on screen. You'll notice they're all at 2 players, even though you can play this game at single player and 2v2. It's just that we didn't try those because going to depth about those probably isn't very conducive to people wanting this game. How to play? Okay, this is quite complicated, so here we go. The goal for the Atriedes player is to meet a certain number of the 3 types of prescience points, shown by their secret card. To do this, they'll be completing various tasks that flip over every round, and you can get points via exploring ecological stations and by conquering Harkonnen bases. Actually, if they ever take the capital of the game, Arrakis, they also win the game. The goal for the Harkonnen is to get 10 supremacy points, which are victory points. But they don't have tasks to do, rather they're all about killing, so they get points when destroying Atriedes sieges. Oh, they can also pay a currency called spice to get points. Both sides will pursue their goals in rounds where you roll a bunch of action dice, trade off turns consisting of using them, then the round ends when all the dice are spent. So let's break it down. Round start has each player drawing 2 planning cards, one from each deck, which are cards that can be spent via any action die. Then the 3 prescience card for the Atriedes to maybe do this round are flipped over. Vehicle placement time. So the Harkonnen player places stuff equal to their tracks on a sideboard. Harvesters are to collect spice and are placed on desert, and ornithopters and carryalls go in air zones. We'll explain these all later. Then dice are rolled. You put them in their slots, and the Atriedes player goes first. Actions can be moving troops with a cool unit called a leader, just moving a bunch of troops, deploying more troops, drawing cards, or lastly doing your house specialty. Oh, you might have realized that the Atriedes have way less dice than the Harkonnen, so how does that work? Well, they can perform Desert Power, which they can do if they have fewer unused action dice, which happens a lot of the time. Desert Power lets them interact with the desert, so now let's talk about the Worms. As this desert action, you can place 2 Wormside tokens down on different desert spaces. They don't do anything by themselves, but if Harkonnen troops walk into them, they get flipped over, and a Sandworm might spawn. Sandworms are cool, because while they're not considered Atriedes troops, they can be activated via desert action to attack or move. Obviously, they must stay on desert. The Atriedes player can can also sand ride the worms, as when they move, they can use any worm sign tokens or sandworms to extend their movement. This can also be used to attack. Wait, so that's all Atriedes. What did the Harkonnen get? Well, ornithopters are like one-time use sand riding to get to move 2 areas. Also can be used to attack. Also, their carryalls can pick up and thus save harvesters from worm signs that become worms. Okay, let's talk about combat. So you just roll 1 dice per unit you have in your legion. Leaders don't add dice. But if you roll this special symbol, they can give you more goodies. You also get the special symbol if you do an attack called a surprise attack. Before rolling dice, both players can also discard cards from their hand to add 1 die per card discarded. Then you roll the dice. Special symbols get converted, but ultimately it's just shields blocking out hits. Then both sides assign damage to themselves. As for fighting harvesters, the moment Atriedes troops move into one, that harvester dies. That's it, real simple. Let's say both players have spent all their action dice, so now it's the end of the round. The desert acts up as you place 1 worm sign in desert areas with Harkonnen miniatures. Then you flip every single worm sign token on the board, worms may spawn and wreck Harkonnen plans. Then you roll for the desert storms for all Harkonnen legions not in a mountain. The Harkonnen then collect spice from remaining harvesters. Then they can spend spice to move up markers on the sideboard or keep the markers at their current spot. Otherwise these markers move down and eventually the Harkonnen loses dice actions. And they can spend 3 spice to move up 1 VP if at 5 or less VP. Then it's the end of the round, the Atriedes can claim end of round prescience cards, then you check if they won the game. If not, just remove all flying vehicles from the board and it's time for the next round. Yes, that is an extremely bare bones of an explanation because more will be explained in the pros. Component pros time. And man, does this game have a lot of cool stuff on the board and even above the board. Okay, yes, the miniatures are absolutely awesome with their flying carryalls and ornithopters. Like, it really makes the flying above the desert surface wee idea hit home. And clear standees never block any visuals of gameplay. For the Atriedes, they got the 4 sandworms, which look appropriately imposing next to any other mini. And you even got the alternate wild maker as its own separate unit. And leaders for each side are cool. And you got the ballooning Baron Harkonnen here, the majestic Stilgar, and Chani appropriately looks like the BA Fdakin she is. Yeah, there's just a lot of leaders, miniatures, bigger minis, you get the point, minis are cool. We'll just end by pointing out how there's 2 different types of normal and elite unit and special best units per faction. Oh, there's actually 3 different normal Harkonnens here. They totally didn't have to provide all this cool stuff. It's nice to give legions some more visual flavor. Visual flavor is also on the Atriedes task cards, which are looking nice and diverse. And yes, all the leader cards also have cool art. The dice are also great to roll. The action dice have super clear symbols, and the combat dice being smaller makes them easier to distinguish, which are also sorted by color, which helps organize the game. They totally didn't have to do this as well. The game board is vibrant, it feels solid, and these cardboard pieces you put on when you nuke mountains feel really chunky and drive that momentous event home. In front of you, the player boards are quite cleanly implemented. I mean, I remember War of the Ring having no player board, and we've come quite a ways. But yeah, there's also now a spot for all the dice. Like right after you roll them, you slot them in. And if the area fills up, that means you get to place a die somewhere else. Great component smoothing out gameplay there. And when you spend, they get their own section. This makes looking at how many dice your opponent has left so easy to track, because that really matters in this game. Oh yeah, all symbols are really intuitive, by the way. It's also a great idea for the leader card to replace spaces on your player board when you unlock said leader. And some leaders will say if they start the game, which makes setup easier. Speaking of setup, it's actually made smoother through deployment tokens for each side, where you just smack these down. Then the Harkonnen flip them over for initial spawn. You don't even flip over the Atriedes ones because they're secret. In fact, you don't even flip them until you need to, making troop management for them so much easier. Again, components facilitating the secret gameplay on the desert surface. Lastly, there's a pretty solid insert in the form of a giant cardboard box inside your box. This has 3 plastic trays, divides cards and tokens well, and has a spot for each mini. And thank you to Cool Mini or Not for explaining where miniatures actually go for post-game easiness. Now we get into the gameplay pros, and of course we gotta talk about the steep thematic asymmetry that's behind pretty much every single aspect of the game here. To start us off on this map, the Harkonnen are playing a inside out sort of gameplay, and the Atriedes are playing an outside in sort of gameplay. The Harkonnen start with tons of centralized units and can easily airdrop more in. I mean, Baron Harkonnen to upgrade 3 regular units to 3 elites every round is fantastic. In being lumped from the middle, the Harkonnens can easily strike out in numbers, and they also have stronger card draw than the Atriedes to help them launch more attacks and spawn more troops. They have a more consistent way of getting the best troop, the Sardaukar. Whether it be through cards that spawn them or having the Emperor arrive and convert your elites into Sardaukar wherever you want, no questions asked. Harkonnen have a brutal early game, with Beast Raban getting to move twice from the start, and eventually Fade comes in to kill him and lets you move and attack in 1 action. Move and attack in 1 action. Where do the Harkonnen suffer? Well, first, they're not native to the desert, so the storms do hurt them if they're outside mountainous areas like their home. And they can trigger sandworms if they're walking on worm signs, or how worm signs pop up on them at the end of the round if they're in desert. But also, do you remember these ornithopters? Well, they're amazing for launching attacks, as you get to move 2 spaces. But then the ornithopters are gone. So then troops can sometimes be stuck on the outside of the board, as all the sieges are fairly spread out from each other. As Harkonnens, you have to think about having a return plan for your troops, or are they just gonna wallow around in the storm as they walk around the desert? And the sieges are all hidden, so the Harkonnen has to either spend ornithopters to flip them over as a free scout action, or they're just gonna have to bet that they're hitting one that their army can handle. We didn't mention this yet, but attacking a base, whether it be Atriedes sieges or Harkonnen settlements, that number on it adds to the number of dice the defender rolls. And as the attacker, if you like to keep doing combat rounds, you'll have to lose a troop for each additional round, which is extra ouchies. So while the Harkonnen are initially stronger, they're still forced to always play offense to find the right side sieges that their combat force will face a mechanical disadvantage against. Now for the heroes of the story, the Atriedes. They definitely have way less starting units, but they have a lot of flexibility in being spread all over the board. Any of their bases can spawn troops. Also, they always go first in each round, which can give them the element of attacking first. And while the Harkonnen have the industrial flight, the Atriedes got nature on their side for warm riding, for actually an insane movement potential that doesn't run out until the end of the round. Like, it cannot be understated how they can just go wee and move halfway across the board as one movement. You just gotta set it up with warm times via desert action beforehand. And that's actually a big chunk of Atriedes gameplay, doing this desert action to drop warm signs to set up their later plays. Whether they're anticipating where the Harkonnen are going and try to slow down their path, maybe they fake an attack themselves, or they're just setting up a nice transport of troops. Also, the Atriedes start with Stilgar for moving 3 legions as one action as opposed to 2, so that extra movement does add up. The Atriedes also get to blow up the mountain to bits via family atomics if one of their tracks gets high enough, which blows the game open and letting the storm slowly damage Harkonnen scum in their pompous city. And you can now attack those areas with sandworms. Like, that mountain space is now desert, and if you ever take a Harkonnen settlement, you take that number and boost all your tracks. This means that the Atriedes can always pivot from their prescience hunting game of doing tasks, like sacrificing a leader, or riding a sandworm, or occupying certain territories, to an all-out attack to the middle, probably via sand riding. If we zoom out both factions for actual gameplay, the Harkonnen have a bunch of dice. The Atriedes have less, but again always go first, and are constantly warm sign dropping, while the Harkonnen are figuring out how to ferry troops appropriately with the ornithopters to take out the best sieges. Atriedes also have a more forgiving regeneration tank at 3 spaces instead of 5, meaning that kill leaders can come back in the time of 3 of your action dice, more forgiving for Paul to see the action again. Now let's talk about the leaders for each faction and how they're thematically implemented. The Atriedes start out with wee young lad Paul Atriedes, who doesn't do much, but can eventually become Paul Muad'Dib. He can have 3 times the special symbol payout during combat, but can let you desert power, then surprise attack with a leader. This can translate into desert power for double warm sign, then surprise attack in the same turns, so you can pretty much attack anywhere close to you. Or you can desert power to attack with a sandworm to soften up the enemy, then surprise attack. The Atriedes can also get Gurney Halleck to spawn in any desert via a card, because he's a lone smuggler who has insane combat stats. Or Chani, who is one with the Fremen to really help recruitment efforts by getting to choose between 2 deployment tokens when spawning. Or Aaliyah, who can discard whatever action die of the Harkonnens you want, which is a streamlined way to reflect her cool big brain skill from the lore. And while not a leader per se, the Atriedes can get Wild Maker, which makes your desert action place a sandworm anywhere you want. This can put continued pressure on the board as sandworms cannot be killed and only disappear after attacking. For the Harkonnen, we already talked about Fade being insane, and the Emperor coming in to make seemingly everything Sardaukar. But the Harkonnen also have Gaius Helen for a defense of 3 if you're ever threatened on your home bases. And then you get to draw 2 cards and play one as one action. Heck, this is bleeding into progression, so let's talk about some other forms of it. Do you see this Spice Must Flow table for the Harkonnen? This is meant to reflect the allied parasites that demand spice from the Harkonnens every round. And if you don't pay for spice, you can lose action dice, but then get more vehicle. Thus, both players can look at this table and look at how many vehicles they want the Harkonnen player to have next round. For example, the Harkonnen player can disregard their spice production early to get more ornithopters for insane troop movement and scouting. Then later on, pay spice to move the tracks back up so the Harkonnen have more dice to close out the game. Another form of progression are the Bene Gesserit tokens, which act as these one-time use wild dice for the Atriedes to use, given when the Harkonnen reaches certain point thresholds. And they help individual rounds definitely feel more impactful, which stands out more because there's very few rounds in the game. Yeah, in fact there's only about 4 to 5 rounds in War for Arrakis, making it run very true to 2 hours once you understand all the rules. This game cannot drag because the mostly immovable sieges will either be destroyed or revealed after not too long. Which means that those high value ones to end the game for the Harkonnen will probably be destroyed. And or the Atriedes late game with Paul Muad'Dib is so insane that he's going to start game ending fights. We got matches to be 1 hour 45 minutes for our 4th and 5th game. So with setup, the entire time can't be much more than 2 hours, which is a really impressive feat for such a thematic game. And of course the replay value is quite good in getting to play with different asymmetric sides, and you'll see different card draws and random siege placement. Before our wrap up of theme meeting gameplay pros, I want to talk about this really clean combat system here. First, First, the decision to discard any card from your hand to add 1 die per card really adds more tension to combat, even if you think you're winning on the board. It also makes you pay attention to your opponent's hand size all the time because you're curious about what they're going to discard. If they don't discard something, maybe you can guess what's in their hand. And attacker always discards first. This gives a defender more breathing room, especially if the attack was a surprise attack against them, which adds a free symbol. And the combat is just rolling the simple dice. The symbols are easy to understand, the special symbol converts easily to the other two, and you just assign hits. That's it. It being so fast definitely keeps the game length down. The only wrinkle is that the special Fadakin/Shardukar, which are just smooth operators. They don't make you fuss around with different dice or phases. They're just simply elite units that cancel out a block, which doesn't add any fuss to rolling and still feels extremely intimidating or rewarding depending on what side of the barrel or crysknife you're on. For the final pro, we just gotta talk about how the theme meets the gameplay in so many areas. There's no doubt this game is just dripping with Dune theming. It couldn't have been in any other universe, and there's so many story moments from the first book. There's the Atriedes leaders constantly riding the worms, even doing it to get prescience points to fulfill their prophecy, or you can have Pollen's mom hang out in the deep desert to fulfill the prophecy. Or the Tahadi challenge, which I imagine is to kill Jamis, which just takes out a generic leader. Eventually you'll family atomics, which can displace troops on the board and cause a massive flood of Atriedes through the middle. Oh yeah, it definitely goes without saying that the beloved Fade Rothra and Muad'Dib, the two heroes of their side, their entrance to the board are key turning points due to how both of them give 2 times efficacy for a single action die. It's not surprising they'll have a massive showdown. Cons! Where else to start the cons than the rulebook? I thought we came a long way from War of the Ring, because it is prettier, but it's filled with so much confusion for such a rules-dense game. First, it's really vague on what a sector or deep desert is, because while it shows you what it is as an example, it doesn't actually define it. That's like a geography textbook telling you that all these blue puddles are lakes. Then later on it quizzes you and asks you to explain it yourself. Deep desert is any desert touching the edge of the board. Minor Urg is also confusing because this looks like a desert, so is it a desert as well? It's kind of the same color. Nope, it's its own territory, so you can't drop harvesters or sandworms there. It also doesn't help that if you look at the index for Minor Urg, it just pushes you back to the map. Frickin' A. Or when going through each of the actions, why not show a diagram of the action it's explaining? Especially since words like siege token or naib leader won't mean anything to you if you haven't played the game yet. It's also funny that how under the track explanations for each faction, they don't even give the ways the tracks move up. Like, come on, give us some example here to give us some understanding of how these might move up. Harkonnen just say attack sieges and put a siege being destroyed. And Atriedes just show an example of a card. It's just truly rules within rules. The rulebook in general is just hopelessly wordy. Let's go over how they explain action resolution, okay? The action resolution phase is the most important phase of the game. It is during this phase that the players carry out their plans by executing actions, trying to achieve their victory conditions. This is 33 words. Why is this so wordy? You could just say, this is the most important phase where players do actions to try to achieve their victory conditions. That is 16 words. This wordiness is everywhere in this rulebook, okay? I wanted to research other people's experiences with the rules, and yeah, there being over 400 rule entries on the BGG forum when the game is not even that old means that others are also super confused as well. But shout out to the guy Kevin Chapman for answering tons of questions on BGG. Looks like he's affiliated with the game design process in at least some way, and is also a big War of the Ring fan. Then I'm completely befuddled on why there's no player aids. This game is so complex that you want something to look at, something to explain all the different phases and types of movement in the game. So yeah, you'd want to be reading something when your opponent is going through this in your first 1 or 2 games, because that's gonna happen all the time. There's a rules reference at the back of the rulebook, which is nice, but guess what? You can't read that if your opponent is holding the rulebook, huh? Like a proper player aid could help you through when to use Bene Gesserit tokens, the steps to resolve combat in, how fighting a settlement is different, what each faction gets as upgrades, how sandwriting versus ornithopter movement is. There's just so many crucial rules that should have been printed clearly. Currently you have 2 cards in total, so 1 for each side, and they're not nearly in-depth enough. Oh, and then there's also a big difference between these 2 decks for each side. You frequently get to choose between a draw, but those definitions are only defined in the rulebook. So why not put this info on a player aid, or at least the player boards? War of the Ring, which also has this double deck idea, has different art on the backs of them, so you can at least have an idea of what they're trying to go for, even if you don't fully understand the decks. And then the Spice Must Flow sheet doesn't explain how Imperium Band works as markers move down, which is one of the key elements to play around. This sheet can also totally be way bigger. That's also getting us into other component cons, which do have some confusion here, but it's not too bad. The Harkonnen generic leaders, called Bashar, are so big with the staff that they end up blocking other mini. The Atriedes naib leaders don't have this problem because they're smaller. Then Harkonnen settlements are strangely not double-sided for being a public thing, which can confuse you because their Atriedes counterpart are always secret. But we understand they're trying to cut costs by keeping the printing style uniform. These other Wormside tokens, when flipped over, can also kind of blend in with the desert, so when you're taking them off the board, sometimes you miss a couple. Not a big deal, but they could have been outlined on the sand and burrowing versions. Lastly, for component cons, the Atriedes prescience cards, the very important ones you need to look at every round, are just too hard to see. So they're put in the middle of both players because both sides need to look at them throughout a round. Either these need to be way bigger, or to give the Harkonnen player a player aid of sorts to track them, while the Atriedes player can keep it in their hand or close to them. Like compare this to Star Wars Rebellion, where these cards are secret, so the Rebel player can always look at them closely in their hand. Now it's time for gameplay cons with balance. So yet again, we're using the patch 3.0 rules on Cool Mini or Not's website. And Atriedes have just the double whammy of being not only weaker than Harkonnen, but they're also just harder to play. These two things hit really hard for your first couple games. But yeah, the Atriedes lost every single game we played. Some were close though. Atriedes set the tempo for the game because them going out and performing their tasks ends up leaving a section of the board weaker, which the Harkonnen are glad to attack the immovable sieges to get victory points. So why does it make it harder for Atriedes? Well, the Atriedes are more prone to making mistakes while they're doing this, but also they cannot plan around which objectives come up because they're totally random. These give a set payout between 3 colors, which might not always match your secret objective. But wait, Harkonnen don't vibe with the desert, because isn't that their weakness? Well, not really here. It's not like Dune 1979, where the storm just wipes out units. Rather, you just roll 2 dice if they're in the desert, which can lead to 2 hits at max, which tickles huge forces. Like let's say you get 1 hit that reduces 1 elite to 1 normal. That doesn't change how much dice are rolled for the first round of combat, which is usually the most impactful. Weird how the storm hit doesn't scale with Legion size. But sandworms, right? Well, when you worm sign against Harkonnen to hopefully spawn something, the Legion can just retreat off so they don't get hurt. When the sandworm is chosen to attack, it rolls 4 dice, meaning you can get something good, but it's only for 1 roll. The sandworm just dips after that. You can't really plan to clear troops predictably off of 1 roll, right? And remember, it's a random chance to spawn a sandworm in the first place. The Harkonnen also have more of a consistent ramp, as they have more dice to trigger more of their strong leader abilities faster from the beginning, and they can pay spice to move up their VP until 5, which makes getting their 2 leader unlocks faster. The Atriedes have no consistent way to move up a color they want besides launching an attack, which is hard to do early game. Getting an ecological station is crucial for them, which is a 1/3 chance of getting a color they want. That's just how it works for the Atriedes. It is also kind of weird that the Emperor, who is not only a good leader in of himself, but also grants the starter card creation engine, can be dropped round 1 if you play his planning card. There's no prerequisite to drop him. I understand it's cool thematically for him to be in play early, because the Emperor is here early, that's cool. But his starter card engine is really good in this game, where the Atriedes don't even have access to a Fadakan engine ever. Here's some more reasons of the Harkonnen being crazy. The Harkonnen win immediately once they get the final siege to get 10 victory points. The Atriedes don't win immediately when they get their win condition, rather they have to wait until the end of the round. In the 3.0 rules, it says that Atriedes can instant win if they take Arrakis, the Harkonnen capital, which makes sense, but this is also insanely hard to do. It keeps going. There's a busted Harkonnen card to discard 2 of the Atriedes cards, then draw 2 cards. This is a +3 in cards. Sure, it costs an action, but Harkonnen are usually doing better in actions. They also are more likely to use their house die on playing cards, so this card is just easy to play and can straight up just turn rounds on their head. This card should not be in this game, at least to this strength. Another strong Harkonnen card is Hope Cloud's Observation, to shuffle back one of the Atriedes' prescience cards during a round. This is insanely strong, as you can see the Atriedes setting up for a card because they think you don't have a counterplay against it. Then bam, you drop this for a mere 1 die cost, and now they don't get points that round for their efforts. An ability this strong should at least have a cost attached to it, and or let the Atriedes play around it. There's also the fact that this game wants to be so thematic around Lady Jessica that her objective cards aren't actually good. She's like an expensive story objective, where you pay 1 die in total to play her, because you're not going to play her over Stilgar or Paul, then you pay another die to remove her to get 3 of only 1 color. This is also just kind of dull, uninteractive gameplay as you just do it in the corner of the map. In a game where one side has to do random missions, whereas the other one has a beatdown style of gameplay, well, the one that has to do random missions is always going to suffer from some weird variance from game to game. That's just how it is. To do these interesting missions, the Atriedes will probably have to move in interesting ways around the map, which for first games, the Harkonnen will just easily punish you by playing mountains patrols to just spawn units on the board, or this one to spawn units in a mountain space. Again, this can easily just take undefended or relatively undefended sieges. Let's compare this to Star Wars Rebellion. That also does the cat and mouse idea, where the rebels are like the Atriedes and having secrecy on their side. The reason why the balance works better in Star Wars Rebellion is because the rebel player gets to choose where the rebel base is for mind games all the way through the game, so then the Empire is wasting efforts, whereas the Harkonnen are always getting something from attacking a siege. But also, the rebel tasks are for one track instead of 3, and the tasks are sequenced in a deck, and they get their leader ramp at the same time every game. Okay, so moving on from balance, let's talk about some of the wacky randomness here. So it's not too bad, but especially gets hurt because the game is shorter. Let's get into it. So the game's action die symbol is based off of War of the Rings. Roll at the start of a round. These dice determine what you can do during that round. Thing is that War of the Ring has way more rounds because it's about twice as long as War for Arrakis. And then they also have the Rings of Power to help the free people. You're just more likely to get subpar rolls in Dune, even though this is technically smoothed out by the cap of phases you get during a round and the Gen of Ezra tokens. It's just not quite enough sometimes. Like, if you just happen not to roll certain deployment rolls as Atriedes, you can get really punished early game as you can't reinforce sieges under attack. There's only 3 planning cards that directly spawn troops and sieges, and only 3 to redirect enemies when near. Speaking of planning cards, there's this card, Hawat Scheming, which is meant to be a cool introduction of Gaius Helen, as you can discard 2 or 3 of these matching cards to spawn her. Thing is that this card throws off beginner Harkonnen expectations of what to get from a draw. Like, say if they're getting cards to discard some for combat, and then they draw this card, well, that's a buzzkill. What's more is that even if you know how this card works, if you discard 2 of them to spawn Gaius, then you draw another one of this card later on, this card is completely useless, which feels awful. At least be able to discard it for combat if Gaius Helen is on the board. Lastly, there should be printed how many of this card exists, so you have some context on why discarding 2 versus 3 makes sense. On the Atriedes side, tested with the Gom Jabbar to get a new objective card is freaking nuts. An amazing early game draw, and this planning card replaces itself. But this card isn't as good late game because you're already committed to colors, but who knows, you might just win the game off playing this card. In an epic scope game, a card like this should be a mid-game draw, hence maybe the deck should be sequenced so you always draw this in mid-game, or just take it out of the game. Then let's talk about the swinginess of combat. So as mentioned in pros, combat is fast. There's actually no blinks. Every symbol can do something, especially if you have a lot of leaders to convert special symbols. So this game is quickly bloody compared to War of the Ring, since a hit is a 50% chance, with a unit that straight up negates blocks. And if you surprise attack from an action, you get a special symbol, so you're probably just turning that into attack. This means that combat is often usually decided on the first roll, as there's the initial flurry of hits. And if you just roll badly in a couple of those early fights, you're just behind because you get to roll less dice. That's just how it is. This swinginess isn't that big of a deal though, because of how fast this game's design wanted to be. The final con here is that there is some weird theme meeting gameplay, but again, not that big of a deal. So we already mentioned how the Harkonnen don't really get punished that hard for being in desert, and also the desert doesn't really restrict their movement. Then Baron Harkonnen converting 3 normals into 3 elite units just doesn't make sense. It makes it sound like he's training troops, but that's not what he does. He should be about torturing, so removing a normal to get planning cards. We also struggle to understand how still suits, like what fremen wear on their bodies to preserve water, is going to lead to all the stuff on this card. Or how a grandmother of a storm isn't even a special role for the storm. It's just doing the role in a different phase. Is this really that epic of a storm? Come on. Lastly, there's no mention of water anywhere in this game. I mean, there is the ecological stations, but that's vague at best to water. Scoring! Now it's time for a recommender score, where we try to critically evaluate the aforementioned pros and cons, with the caveat of whether or not this is even a good idea in the first place. And this is a highly asymmetrical 1v1 war game with some multiplayer modes we didn't cover, but it's a 1v1 war game in 2 hours. Seems like a fine idea to me. So this is gonna get a recommender score of 7 out of 10. It is good. War for Arrakis is definitely a bang for time war game experience for you and a buddy to just hop right in, finish this in 2 hours, once you get the rules down, of course. With riding the worms to launch attacks, and then using the ornithopters to find those sneaky hidden sieges. If you're a Dune fan that likes heavy war gaming, this is definitely overall good. There's a lot of streamlining and mechanics compared to War of the Ring, like how you get to discard any card to boost combat instead of choosing to commit a double use card you have to carefully read. And instead of micromanaging different warring factions to fight, you get blistering fast progression of cool leaders to fight and move rapidly. You can get a couple sweet upgrades within 20 minutes here. Also, components are heavily streamlined, you have an actual player board, and the rulebook is bad, but isn't completely goobly glop elvish. If we were to boil down the problems with War for Arrakis, even though there's no water in this game, it would be 1. Rules suck, and 2. Atriedes suck. And those are both pretty big deals in wanting a war game where you'll feel satisfied while mucking through all the rules to the end. I really get the impression that by this being only 2 hours and Atriedes being as particular to pilot as they are, that you're supposed to play a lot and get really familiar with all the planning cards and leaders. But seeing in how there's so many components and how your first games can either be 4 hours if they're not a giant Harkonnen sweep, you're gonna be in the minority if you get to play this game regularly. I mean, think of how its predecessor, War of the Ring, is touted as a great once a year thing. This is half the lane. So you're gonna play this twice a year now? Maybe? Hilariously, after our first gameplay, we were looking up stuff on gameplay balance and stumbled upon this upcoming expansion, which adds stuff to each faction, like new units, cards, and a freaking new action called Desert War. Maybe this buffs Atriedes. Now at a glance, this seems awesome. It not only adds more fun thematic ingredients like attacking ornithopters, but can deepen the strategic possibilities too for people who've played it a lot, like us. Always fascinating to see if an expansion fixes a game, so Muad'Dib willing. Maybe the expansion raises this recommended score by 1 point to get it to 8 out of 10. Great. But let's go back to War for Arrakis' current state and have it next to its granddaddy, War of the Ring, because I can't finish this video without going into at least some depth about the comparisons. War of the Ring is a 3 to 4 hour plus story packed with 3 books worth of characters, story, and map, with the named fortresses, varying factions for each side, and even a side hunt for Frodo, which is actually the most important thing. War for Arrakis doesn't have that. Rather, it's jumping legions as you position within 2 hours across an entire planet for mystery point sieges. Siege to Pur, by the way, is only a phrase on your player board. But movement is fast, the killing is fast, and doing objectives makes the points go up fast, but may not always feel the most rightfully thematic when you're sending Paul and his mom to do some random thing in the desert while Sardaukar legions are breathing down your neck. Like, this game sells the guerrilla warfare of Dune, and with that, we can see maybe accomplishing a random task as the Atriedes, and they win the game without even winning a crucial battle. Then again, the Book of Dune isn't all desert warfare. There's a lot more political intrigue and world building than just fighting. So the translation of that to a war game isn't as clean as, say, War of the Ring. There's not always going to be an epic showdown like the dwindling Free People's armies holding Minas Tirith while Frodo treks through Mount Doom, or their Star Wars Rebellion blowing up the Death Star while a fight for the one hidden rebel base happens. War for Arrakis can still have epic finishes. Remember that family atomics exists and you can sand ride to full-on attack Carthage or Arrakis. Just don't expect it every time. And hey, it's only 2 hours where swings and dice rolls and card draw do matter more with less rounds. It's ultimately a good compromise of ideas for Dune lovers, just not great, even with the patched rules. If you're not a Dune lover, maybe commit a couple more hours and grab one of these instead. Rebellion is good if you like the cat and mouse nature of hidden bases. For those hardcore War of the Ring fans, War for Arrakis is a supplemental action dice wargaming. It's not replacing this, at least not without the upcoming expansion. I don't know. If you're looking for other Dune games, we'd recommend in a heartbeat Dune Imperium Uprising, which the review is coming soon, that is solid for a wide range of groups, where you're getting much better bang for buck and having a more palatable, replayable game. However, it is definitely more clinical than an area control where you're fighting for space on the board. So if you want something more accessible for 4 players, our quick recommendation is still Dune Conquest. Then if you want the most thematic Dune game of all, but don't mind heaps and heaps of old school wargaming jank, there's always the original Dune, the board game, which we don't recommend, but think is a fascinating example of theme meeting gameplay. My personal score for Dune War for Arrakis, as a lover of War of the Ring, which I don't play anymore, and a lover of Star Wars Rebellion, which is one of my favorite games of all time. So Dune War for Arrakis is going to be a personal score of 7 out of 10. I have a good time with it. You guys know that I like the Dune theme. Obviously, it does take a backseat for me compared to Lord of the Rings. And I like the Star Wars universe actually more than Dune, especially for a board game. But I like Dune. It's a cool universe. It's pleasant. 4th book is awesome. So this review was a long time coming, and I ultimately have really mixed feelings towards this game as my enjoyment kept going up and down. First, I wholeheartedly enjoy all the quality of life and streamlining this game is doing. A heavy board game that is actually only 2 hours is a perfect blend of bang for buck and time. Also, I can easily schedule to play it and set it up unlike War of the Ring. It's gonna be hard for me to go back to not having a player board in War for the Ring, or using War for the Ring's less streamlined combat system. Movement now with the ornithopters and the sand riding feels so elegant as well, once you get the rules down. But now there's always just action happening on the board, and I'm continually interested in what's going on. When I'm sitting here looking at my action dice versus my opponent action dice, it's a very similar feeling to War of the Ring, where I'm just trying to figure out when's the best way to counterplay my opponent's dice here. How do I optimize my troops? When should I spawn leaders? Where should I spawn leaders? What's the best way to make a surprise attack? Oh, and then this is the first Dune game I've played where Sardaukar actually feel like the feared Sardaukar from the books. It feels amazing to use them. They're a bit of a power trip, of course, but it's quite satisfying to launch them into battle. And I got to attack with sandworms and use Shai Hulud himself. It's so satisfying rolling those dice and killing those pesky Harkonnen running around my home desert when I play as Atriedes. So what are my problems with the game then? Well, it's not nearly as thematic or epic as I'd like it to be for how much effort I'm putting into setup and play it. Let's start with theme. The board itself actually feels pretty dry to me compared to War of the Ring or Rebellion. Fights are typically around hidden sieges with no visual differentiation. They are in different places in the desert, but it's all just desert to me and it feels vanilla. Sure, when we're fighting around the Polar Sink or Arrakis Carthage area, then I get a cool mental image. But otherwise on the board, stuff doesn't really evoke much to me. Like I remember the Free People's troops running out in War of the Ring. And while there are technically limited deployment tokens at War of the Ring, the game is too short to really matter. So there's not that tension with limited troops, and I don't think this was a design goal either. My eyes get misty on fighting tooth and nail at Osgiliath to slow down the Shadow's advance, or launching a counterattack into Dune Guldur with elves, high risk, high reward play, or even just moving the Fellowship around the board gave me a key visual. And Arrakis, it's often that getting sieges just feels like getting Euro VP, satisfying in a winning sort of way, but not ha destruction sort of way. Another Euro VP is the spice, because it doesn't really feel like spice here. It's just a random currency you're paying to entities from afar. An early game, you use it to buy yourself literal victory points. When I'm playing as Atriedes, I don't like how their victory conditions are set up. First, I really don't like having to look at these random feeling objectives all the time, and also just completing them just doesn't feel that good. It just feels like a checklist. And leaders. Some of them actually don't feel like the living, breathing leaders in the other heavy 1v1 games, because sometimes in Arrakis, they're just not worth spawning because their stats are okay. So they're just ability granters which sit on your player board, which doesn't feel that thematic. Also, the game is short again, so sometimes you unlock leaders and barely get to use them. Obviously, Paul and Fade should always see play on the board, but I'm contrasting that to War of the Ring, where even though there are so many leaders, many of them had their time to shine. Even the Hobbit Seas were part of their own fighting front. Everyone was just writing their own story in that game. Man, I'm just so Lord of the Rings biased. Obviously, I like those movies way more too than the movies here. Oh, and then lastly for theme, I really wish there was at least some more art or graphic design on the planning cards. Man, they look so vanilla. I'm left with a game that I really only want to play Harkonnen for in a less life-changing experience than I imagined. But I'm having a good time because it is a solid thematic 1v1 area control still. Man, why can't there be a War of the Ring 3rd edition that takes a lot of the quality of life of this game? Cool mini or not, if you make that, I'll make the review. Or at least a video. There would be a bigger reason for me to return to this if, say, these ecological tokens were in different starts on the board, or maybe you had different leader starts here, or maybe there are different scenarios. But again, I know that's not what this game is trying to be. Granted, if I were playing against a complete noob, I'd be happy to try Atriedes again, just to see how it feels like to go on the offensive. Because my favorite game of this was when I family atomic the middle, and I threatened Carthage with a strike force. But of course I lost because Harkonnen are just better. But that's a fun goal to aspire to. Take the middle with Muad'Dib. Just like the movies. Good time with this game, it's just not a favorite of mine. After my 4th and 5th game of this, the final games, my buddy and I, we just turned to each other and said, if we put in 2 more hours, we could have played Star Wars Rebellion, and that would have been a much better experience. If I've never played this, War for Arrakis might be an 8 out of 10, and if I never played War of the Ring, then War for Arrakis would be for sure an 8 out of 10. That was it, War for Arrakis. I'm pretty sure it's Arrakis. I probably switched out the sayings throughout this video, but yeah, thank you guys for watching. This review took a long time to make. Not as long as War of the Ring, because this game is not as janky. But yeah, I'd really appreciate it if you guys would leave a comment, drop a like, especially if this review helped you with the game in some way. Also, we have a Patreon and a Ko-fi if you'd like to help support us make big reviews like this. Anyways, that's it for War for Arrakis. Yeah, remember, actually for fun, in the description below, why don't you tell me which game you like the most? This one, War of the Ring, and Star Wars Rebellion. Which of the 3 you like the most? Anyways, see you guys later. Like, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff. Bye-bye.